right, guys, welcome back to another episode of The Resilience Show. And if you could see and look around, we're not in my studio. We're in the Bahamas at North Bimini Island, and I'm here with Dr. Lindsay Bira, who's a lot of things. In fact, I'm going to read your bio, but one of the things you are is you're a psychologist, and you're a freediving instructor, which is kind of how we're here together. And we're going to be doing some work together on not the Resilience Show, but my show, Shadow Figures, in a filming, and you're working with myself and some of the other military divers on an episode that we're doing. But I want to make sure that our audience knows who you are, so I'm going to read your bio. Lindsay Bira is a PhD and is a clinical health psychologist, medical professor, and speaker known for her work in trauma, PTSD, resilience, and human performance. She trained at Harvard Medical School, earned her PhD at the University of Miami, and completed a 2-year fellowship in trauma psychology. Her research has been published in Nature magazine and featured by Science, Forbes, NPR, Women's Health, Headspace, and other outlets. A former psychologist for active duty military and veterans, Dr. Bira now brings evidence-based tools to a global audience. She is the founder of Ocean-Oriented Resilience Expeditions, serves as a chief scientific officer at the University of Edinburgh's Planetary Health Lab, and advises Eldea Health in AI innovation leader. She also serves on multiple organizational boards. Based in Miami, Dr. Bira is passionate about translating cutting-edge science into real-world tools that builds resiliency, performance, and well-being across the globe. Dr. Bira, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I mean, I'd say thanks for being here, but I think we're all happy to be here.
Yeah,
we're in the Bahamas.
Yes.
It's so beautiful outside. The water is amazing.
Such a special place. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're with a cool group.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm very impressed by you guys.
Yeah, it's been a fun day. You were out with us. We were exploring. I don't want to give it away, but we're exploring and doing some research to try to find evidence of ancient civilizations and ancient technologies. And then in the middle of that, you gave us some lessons on breath work, where all the guys we're working with are experienced military divers and people who have a kind of mastered being composed in the most dangerous situations. And we did a little experiment, and you had us both to bring our heart rates down, and I think which increases our oxygen saturation.
Yes. Yeah. And then you burn oxygen more slowly. So, you guys are going on the mission tomorrow, and the hope is that you can stay down there as long as possible, get all the data that you want to get. And so everybody did a great job today. I think a couple of people almost got their heart rate 20 points lower just through that breath exercise. Yeah.
And we're not still active duty special operations guys. Most of us have been out for a while. I know one of the guys, we were just joking about it. He got out of shape, and he's like, but he was still able to just calm his mind down and bring his heart rate down. And we had talked about it while we were doing. I've done a lot of that through not just in the military, but through MMA fighting and as competing as a professional athlete in jiu-jitsu. And it was things that you were saying as a medical professional, I heard in the coaching room so many times, like being able to compose yourself, bring your heart rate down. It's going to just give you a competitive edge over your opponent.
Yeah. And I loved you sharing that story because, from the perspective of people watching the MMA fights, they don't get to know that insider piece of information, that you were actually using some sports psychology concepts to regulate your own nervous system so that your performance was top notch. Because you said that you wore a heart monitor device during
training.
Yeah, during the training, and kind of got your heart rate lower in between fights, right?
Yeah.
So you had the edge.
Yeah, so I was at this time when we did this, Brad Anderson, who's, was an Olympic alternate team with Randy Couture, who's a 5-time UFC champion. They were coaching me for a fight against a guy named Joseph Sandoval, and who's a UFC fighter. And we're training at 10,000 feet. And so the idea of this fight was to be able to just outpace the guy, outwork the guy, and just break him mentally. That was the whole plan, because the guy was a better striker than me. I was a better grappler than him. And, but being at 10,000 feet elevation, I could, reach a higher level of fitness. But Randy Couture and Brad are both such strategists. So what we would do is we'd push that first 5-minute round as hard as we could to make the guy try to keep up with me and get both of our heart rates up at a high level. But then me have the ability to bring mine back down during that 1-minute break, knowing that he couldn't. And then I go back out in the second round and just put slam the gas, put just a lot of pressure on the guy and break him mentally to win the fight and be able to take him down and submit him. That was a strategy.
Wow.
I ended up winning the fight in 58 seconds, so I didn't have to do it. But in the training, it was we'd get on a treadmill, we'd sprint, we'd jog, we'd sprint, we'd jog. And that last minute, it was like, okay, now we turn on the gas, push the pace. The round's over at 5 minutes. You have 1 minute to recover. Usually you have 45 seconds to sit on the stool because of putting the stool in and out. And so in that time, getting my heart rate back down under 90, so in the 80s. And so, you know, if you're not intentional about that, it's really hard because you're just coming out of a sprint, a very intensive sprint. So getting your heart rate back down to 90 in that period of time. So it's very intentional about relaxing, box breathing. And before that fight camp was over, that training camp was over, we were able to do that. And
Absolutely.
so you talking about all this, I was like, yeah, that's exactly what we were doing.
I love that, you know, and for you guys to have been on such big missions of the world and be among the elite performers with the type of training that you guys have, to be able to share that that's what you've done to regulate your system, because it takes that reset in order to go back in and not burn out.
Yeah. I mean, these guys like, you know, Joey was on the team today, and you know, I spent my whole history in the military was in special operations. Everybody has different jobs. Joey was, out of all of us, was probably the highest, he was the highest level special missions unit tier 1 assaulter. So the guys that are breaching the door, going in the stack and just killing everybody in the room. And those guys like train over and over and over, and either they're doing it through visualization or through repetition, but they reach such a level of composure that, I mean, it's just like going to the range for them, being in a shoot house. I think Joey said it today, there was no difference between being in a shoot house, being in a training environment, or being in a real environment. Everything's the same. And, you know, I've had several incidents myself that where you get in this chaotic moment and it should be stressful, but you're feeling like it's exactly how you trained. It feels like the training environment because you're so familiar with it. And so, I mean, you know, I love the work that you're doing, and I was super interested in it. And I'm glad we decided to do this podcast, because we didn't come here planning to do the podcast. No. So, but here we are. It
worked out that way. Yeah.
So what got you, I mean, as in the medical field, there's so many different things you could do. What got you to where this is your profession? Your specialty is this.
Yeah. So I'm a clinical health psychologist, which is kind of the cross section between psychology and the medical world. And specifically what we look at is we look at the effects of stress. So what creates stress, and then if stress is maintained, then what happens in the long term to our bodies, right? We have a emotional toll that stress has, but we also have a physical toll with inflammation over time that then leads to heart disease, cancers, etc. So as a clinical health psychologist, we focus on getting people's stress down and helping them adjust to situations. Now, this can be also clinical disorders, and there can be a range of different issues that we work with. What got me interested in this specific field is, you know, in early days, I was doing volunteer work with little kids who were abused. And it just blew my mind that somebody's view of reality is so much shaped by what they went through in early days, and how if you get the right resources, you can move through that in a way that you can elevate yourself and come out on the other side. But without the right resources, it becomes really, really difficult. When I went to college, I wanted to be actually a news anchor. So that was the goal. And then I took my first psychology class, and it blew my mind. Then I took abnormal psychology. And once again, that came back to me that somebody can have a little bit of an alteration in their brain chemistry and perceive an entirely different reality than I'm perceiving. We're both looking at the same thing, but we perceive something different. So I started to learn about the brain and found it just fascinating, and then majored in psychology, realized I needed to get my PhD if I wanted to really do anything with it. Got some mentors, fought really hard, and then went to University of Miami and got my PhD. Within that, the lab that I got into was first a cardiovascular lab. So I was doing cardiovascular research, which is still a focus of mine. And then I also got into a trauma-focused lab. So I learned a ton about PTSD, specifically the crossover with PTSD and other issues. And we looked at, if you have somebody who has had a trauma and has PTSD, but that PTSD is not treated, then over time, they have greater risk of developing heart disease, cancer. If they already have a condition, then the markers of their condition are a lot worse. But if you offer evidence-based PTSD treatment and you get their symptoms down, all those markers end up being a lot better, and you can actually mitigate the development of long-term health issues.
Is it because the body under stress makes your body weaker, more vulnerable?
Yes, on all the levels. It's your immune system. It's also cortisol and other inflammatory markers that we release when we have chronic stress.
What is cortisol? I've heard about cortisol a lot because I am one of the ones that have had raging high cortisol. I did the blood test where I had this kit where I pricked my finger and did it like every 2 hours. And then basically I was waking up essentially like in the state of a gunfight. And by the time I was go to bed, it was about the morning and night, like I was just many high levels of cortisol. What is actually cortisol?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I know about it. And, it fluctuates for everyone throughout the day. So it's different in the morning than it is at night. And so when we measure it, it's actually hard to measure. So you usually have to do a urine test. You have to collect the urine, over a certain amount of time to get a good picture of your cortisol. So many people who have high cortisol, they don't even know because it's hard to test. And some providers don't even want to test it because of that. Now, cortisol is released from stress though. So, it has multiple functions throughout the body. And there's also other chemicals that are released in stress. But if we have chronic release of cortisol, it's an inflammatory marker. And so in an acute stress, our body is made to respond to stress, right? We're made to have this flood of chemicals and then we kind of get rid of that and we return to a rest state. So there is this, function of cortisol that allows us to respond to something along with adrenaline and other kind of endogenous chemicals that we have. But if it's released chronically on a low level, that inflammatory marker actually causes inflammation across our tissues in our body and specifically in our heart system. So our arteries and veins, those walls get inflamed and that's how plaque starts to build up. So it can be a rupture and then somebody can have some plaque. And if that breaks off, that can be a stroke or a heart attack. And so this is why this is so important because the top cause of death is heart disease for men and women. 1 in 4 men and 1 in 4 women die of cardiovascular disease of some kind. So if we know that that's the major risk and we know the predictor of that, which is chronic stress, and we know that one chronic stress is untreated mental health symptoms that exist over time. So we're talking about PTSD. We're also talking about anxiety, even depression. So when people live with these conditions over time, they're having a chronic level of stress that is setting their tissues up to, age. There's a lot of talk now about longevity and all this stuff. When I look at longevity and the science around that, I always think the number one tool is to reduce your stress and to treat symptoms if you have it.
We can't always predict what situations we'll find ourselves in and what causes trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, the kind of common definition is the body's normal response to an abnormal situation. So if you think about that, right, it's kind of a conflict of terms, the body's normal response to a abnormal situation. So my body's responding normally. The situation's abnormal, so I'm not disordered at all. My body's doing exactly what it was designed and I believe my body was created to do. So my body's doing what it was designed to do, then how is that a bad thing? And how do you manage that to be manageable?
Yes. And I'll tell you the clinical criteria for PTSD. So in the first month after a trauma, anything goes. So this is the month where we say anything that you're experiencing is a normal reaction to an abnormal event.
Your body's doing what it's supposed to do.
Exactly. Your body's doing what it's supposed to do. You're clearing out chemicals, adrenaline, all this stuff. It's disrupted your constructs of reality. So now you have to develop new ideology and new values sometimes if something just kind of crushed what you previously believed, right?
But what your body's doing what it's supposed to do, probably to protect yourself, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you're going in fight, flight, freeze. You're going in those moments from your limbic system.
Yeah.
So your body's doing what it's supposed to do in that sense.
Absolutely.
But staying there is the bad thing.
Staying there is the bad thing.
Okay.
And, I have clients who contact me in my private practice immediately after a trauma, maybe 2 weeks after, and they say, I haven't slept at all. And I say, you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal event because of course you're not sleeping. Evolutionarily, we have this wiring that if we've detected a threat in the world, your body says, I don't have time to sleep. I need to stay up until this threat resolves itself.
Yeah, if you get in a gunfight and you go to sleep right after, you're probably a sociopath.
Exactly.
Something's probably wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, the thing is this wiring is based in very old times, right? So if we're walking through the woods like a zebra, and there's a whole book on this, I think why zebras don't get ulcers. So if a zebra is grazing, right, it's in rest digest state, and then a tiger starts chasing it, it has a big adrenal response, right? Runs away from the tiger, tiger's gone, it lays down, rests, it shakes off the trauma. So it's literally shaking through chemicals. and then returns to a state of rest. It doesn't have a thought afterwards. It's not thinking, what if this happens again? Like we talked about today in our training, frontal lobe, the zebra does not have a frontal lobe to think about the future or the past. It just exists, right? There's something very refreshing about that. We see that in dogs too. It's like how nice it would be to be a dog. They're just kind of there and happy. So with humans though, we can have something bad that happens. We go into survival mode. So maybe we're not sleeping, but then we're adding things on top of it. We're worried about the future. We have all these beliefs that have now been disrupted. We start to worry about that. So we have a lot more of a complex process, which is why sometimes it doesn't last a day. It doesn't last a week, not even a month. It can go beyond a month.
Go lifetime.
It could go a lifetime. And so beyond a month, but within 3 months, we call this adjustment disorder. You still cannot meet criteria for PTSD within 3 months of a trauma. Now, if these issues go longer than 3 months, that's where you can meet criteria for PTSD if you're striking enough symptoms in all 4 of the domains of it. And so now we have the case where PTSD is what we would call a disorder. So it's a disorder of the nervous system to where your nervous system is not able to return to that rest and digest, which is the healthiest place to be. Something got stuck.
Yeah. And, lots of veterans, myself included, coming back from my last deployment to Afghanistan, I was diagnosed with PTSD and dealt with, debilitating panic attacks and anxiety and depression. And those panic attacks were certainly like a reflection of some things that happened to me. And probably I feel like my body would be, heightened states of anxiety in normal environments, like sitting in an environment like we're right now. Something may happen from a sensory trigger. Then next thing you know, I'm feeling my adrenaline kick up, my heart rate starts pounding. I start getting like just real anxious. My arms go numb, my face goes numb, my throat's swelling shut. Like there's panic attacks, and this is something that probably should have reset, but for whatever reason didn't.
Yeah. And it's because the brain learns so easily. So whatever happened, whatever trauma happened that showed the brain, things aren't okay. I better remember this. Then that sensory information, whether it's sounds, smells is a big one. The way that something feels, that gets encoded and very tied into that response. So then as you just described, panic attacks are really, really difficult. And if somebody hasn't had one, they do not understand it. And, some of my clients will tell me that too. They would say, I always felt like people were being too sensitive until I had my first episode of anxiety. And now I get it. Right. And so we have to remember, our brain is programmed to, have this panic response because something about it is supposed to keep us safe. But then when those associations get attached and it's coming out to disrupt your relationships or enjoyment of the world, that's when, we need to figure out what's happening there and retrain it as best as possible.
What's some examples of retraining? Obviously it's medication. I'm not big on medication, but I'm not big. I'm not against medication. I believe medication can be used to get someone to a place or a point. But if medication is the only part of your plan, then I say it's a bad plan.
Yeah.
That's kind of my perspective. How do you feel about that?
Well, I love being a psychologist and not a psychiatrist because what that means is I don't work with medication. I work with providers who do prescribe. But when I see my clients in private practice, I work with evidence-based treatment from the cognitive, behavioral, and existential or spiritual perspectives. So what I do with somebody is I know what the research says works in terms of how we treat symptoms and how we retrain the nervous system. And so I design that for my client in front of me. So there are 2 things that usually work best with something like panic, which then ties back into PTSD. One is exposure therapy. Yeah, so this is where...
Is this prolonged exposure therapy?
This can be prolonged exposure, PE, okay. Exactly. So we call it prolonged exposure if we're treating post-traumatic stress disorder. We call it exposure if we're treating panic or anxiety. We call it exposure and response prevention if we're treating OCD. So it has a few different names, but it's all under the umbrella of exposure therapy. And it is so effective.
I did prolonged exposure therapy.
You did?
I did it for a year, and I was completely closed off to people like you before that.
Yeah.
Because I had such a bad experience with the VA that through a cognitive therapy that I just felt like I just get exhausted by it. And then I met this lady at the VA, and she said and basically had asked me if I wanted to do cognitive therapy. I said, no, I didn't want to do it again. And she said, well, yeah, have you ever thought about prolonged exposure therapy? And as she started to explain it, it sounded a lot like the perspective, not the same methodology, but the same perspective that I would have from biblical counseling instead of like so I'll explain what I mean by that, because what I look at cognitive therapy was, and I could be wrong, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm neither. What I looked at cognitive therapy from being a patient was that they looked at a situation I was dealing with, a problem that I was having, saying, let's find something to blame it on to offload that burden from me. Like the Sigmund Freud, tell me about your mother, tell me about your father. Let's find somewhere external of you to blame that on, to take that weight off of you. Where I felt like the biblical counseling that I had received was, and I got trained in through the American Association of Christian Counselors, was, it doesn't matter who did what to you, what happened to you, how do you take responsibility for that to move forward in a healthy way? So it's acceptance responsibility. It was, it was
like
different.
inverse,
And so the prolonged exposure was like, it doesn't matter what happened to you. It doesn't matter who did that to you. How are you going to deal with it? And then the methodology was exposing yourself slowly to it to reacclimate your system.
Exactly.
And I did it for a year, and it was very deliberate, very intentional.
So you relived some memories. So they kind of mapped out some memories that are bothering you, or situations.
Experiences. Yeah. And so I went from leading Mighty Oaks. I was very ashamed at the beginning to even admit to people where I was, because I'm running this national program. It's helping so many people with PTSD. But the one thing is, it may sound silly to other people, but to me it did. I kept a little silver bottle everywhere I went, and I didn't go anywhere without it. And it had an Ativan in it, and I would go years without needing it. But there's something about knowing that Ativan pill was there was a safety net, that if I had a panic attack come on, I could go to it. And being separate from that thing would cause me anxiety. And so that's the thing my prolonged exposure did, was I went from leaving it in my car and going on a trail run 1 mile away from it, 2 miles away from it, 3 miles away, then a 7-mile run away from it. Then went from leaving it in my car at the trailhead to leaving it at my house.
Yes.
And then over a year to where I didn't need that pill anymore. I traded that little silver vial for memorization of scripture. And so I tied it to my faith, and the biblical counseling tied to that prolonged exposure. And it really, after a decade of dealing with the panic attacks, the fear of panic attacks, it really freed me from that. But it was the prolonged exposure tied with my faith, those two things together.
I love, love, love that example, because this happens so often that there's just one piece that keeps all the symptoms locked in. And that one piece is actually an avoidance mechanism that feels like a control mechanism. So you holding that Ativan, carrying it with you, felt like you were maintaining control. But actually, we call that a safety behavior or an avoidance behavior that was keeping all those symptoms locked in. And you could tell, because whenever you didn't have it or forgot it, you had anxiety, right? And so by targeting that, and what we call it systematic desensitization, step by step. We also call it gradiated exposure, graduated exposure, because you're doing it step by step by step. Like you said, 1 mile that you'd go without it, right? And then, okay, now your nervous system learned, I went a mile, I didn't die. I didn't have a panic attack. Maybe this is okay. Then you went 2 miles. That is nervous system training. And that's why prolonged exposure and exposure therapy in general is so effective. Just there's not a lot of therapists who are trained in it or trained in it well. And I think that that's the issue. Sometimes people have bad experiences with it.
Well, they said this lady, particularly that led me through this program, she said at the VA that only 10% of the psychiatrists, am I saying it right?
Psychologists,
at the VA, only 10% of them had training in prolonged exposure, but everyone else was cognitive therapists.
Exactly.
And I could tell you from the work that I do at Mighty Oaks Foundation, and the thousands and thousands of veterans we treat with anxiety, depression, acute stress, PTSD diagnosis, like major issues, the approval rating of the VA mental health system is, it's like, I mean, I think the statistics, the actual stats are like 70% disapproval rating of the VA.
I know.
I'm just saying, it's things that I'm sure it's not accurate, but that's, I was
a psychologist for the VA for many, many years. I did a lot of my training there, and I think it's understaffed and people are getting, frustrated. It was hard. I would say it's very hard to be there. I think it's also, people get forced to see you. So you're not, people aren't choosing to see you sometimes. And sometimes people maybe aren't motivated to get better. There's a lot of complexities in there. So the burnout rate is very high.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you should have a personal personality connection with anyone, it should be your therapist, right?
100%.
It should be the person who's going to,
Yes. And sometimes, like in any profession, right? Sometimes you just can't find the person for you. Yeah. So I always encourage people to find, and search for many people.
I'm not giving them a haircut by somebody I don't like, much less
Exactly. A therapist. I know it's very important.
Yeah. So, can you give some other examples of maybe people, like scenarios you've seen in people you worked with that you've done prolonged exposure with? Mm-hmm. I'm kind of curious to hear examples outside of myself.
Oh, absolutely. So I get a lot of specialized referrals for victims of childhood sexual abuse. So kidnapping victims or somebody who was just finally taken out of the home that they've been abused in. And so we have to do exposure therapy with some of the memories that they have because, what gets locked into the nervous system is just so tough. And many times people don't have anybody to talk to about what happened to them. And the shame is so heavy. So just by starting to tell the story, the exposure therapy starts to work. And then we map that out. We create hot spots. So sometimes they cannot tell me something. And I say, you don't have to tell me. In fact, you never have to tell me. But maybe if you tell me a piece of it, you will learn that it's safe. And then we can add a piece onto that. And then maybe we can get to the full story. But if we don't, that's okay too. And every client that I've had in all of these years, they've all told me the full story. And it's been a weight off their shoulders. So that's an example of exposure therapy, is just telling the story and then telling the story enough times to where you lose that emotional locked in component of it. I also treat people for phobias, elevator phobia, speaking phobia, driving phobia, flying phobia, all of the phobias. And I do virtual reality headset. So in real time, and my client can be at their home in another state, and then I control what they're seeing on the virtual reality headset. And so I can create situations and add levels of difficulty into it. I had a patient who, a pretty high performing professional who had a plane phobia and hadn't flown on a plane for 12 years. And then finally needed to take this trip, found me on Google because I listed it on my website and just said, do you think I could ever get over this? And I said, yes, give me 6 to 8 sessions. And he said, no way. I said, yes, shipped him a headset. And then sure enough, in 6 to 8 sessions, he, flew across the world. And so I think that exposure therapy, it's evidence-based, done in the right way. It unlocks a ton of that trap that anxiety brings. One more example for panic attacks that people don't realize. Panic attacks, first, most panic is flagged in the emergency room because people think they're dying, having a heart attack, or going crazy, right?
Yeah, I've been in the emergency room several times. Blood pressure 200 over 130. I'm like, I'm having a heart attack.
Because it's real. No. Your body is actually taking over, right? Anybody, again, who's had a panic attack, you know what that feels like. And it's destabilizing. It's incapacitating, right? So it gets flagged in the emergency room. When people get sent to a therapist, most therapists, they don't exactly know what to do with panic. And so they teach slow breathing. We did slow breathing to get y'all's heart rate down at the beach today, right? So that slow breathing is great for starting to focus on a mission. But when somebody has panic attacks, slow breathing is actually going to have the opposite effect. It might have a positive effect in the beginning, but very quickly, if panic symptoms take over and you try to slow breathe, there's no way in hell that's going to work.
No.
And now they feel even more powerless, even more terrified, and the panic gets rooted in even further.
You'd have to catch it way in advance before.
Yes.
Once it starts going, then.
Yes. Yeah. So slow breathing is not an evidence-based treatment for panic. And I try to say that as clearly as possible because there are so many therapists who are doing that. The evidence-based treatment for panic is what we call interoceptive exposures. So intero means inside. Septive is how we perceive. Exposure is bringing up the difficult thing, right? So what we do with interoceptive exposures is we bring up the sensations of panic and we sit with them over and over and over until they finally say, it's okay to be uncomfortable. I'm not scared of being uncomfortable. An example of that is the breath hold. So I train my clients to hold their breath beyond 60 seconds in a therapy session if they have panic or anxiety, because it teaches them to tolerate distress. It teaches them not to be scared when their body starts to do a thing. It teaches them to just roll with the uncertainty instead of reacting to it. It's a frontal lobe bench press, if you will.
Because most people don't. When you're having panic attacks, you don't know why you're having a panic.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a symptom of a traumatic event, but in that moment of a panic attack, you couldn't say why you're having it.
And in fact, the criteria for panic disorder has to be that you have panic attacks out of the blue.
Yeah.
It can't be triggered by, a dog or driving the car or something acute. It has to be, I don't know what happened. It just came out of the blue. That's panic because your system is just throwing it at you and we're just not sure why.
Yeah.
There's a sensitivity to it.
And then you become so fearful of the symptoms that you induce a panic attack.
Yes. In fact, there's another term for panic and it's called fear of fear. So you're so scared. There's a specifier with panic disorder called agoraphobia, where you're scared of being out, like at a restaurant at a table, because you won't be able to escape to safety. That's agoraphobia. So people stop driving, people stay at home because having a panic attack, really sucks. And to have it in front of people and not be able to escape a movie theater is almost unbearable for people to think about.
Yeah, it is absolutely terrible. So being on the subject of panic attacks, how does if someone's listening and having them right now, like what can they do? Like what do you do? Like with the treatment you talked about?
So go to psychologytoday.com.
Okay.
Go to the therapist finder tool. Put in your zip code. It actually doesn't even, we can see a therapist over telehealth just in your state, right? So you can just put in your state. Then you want to select all the criteria and you want to select somebody who has, I always say, click the box for trauma, PTSD, and exposure therapy, because trauma and PTSD, it's harder to get that type of training. But so if you select those boxes, then usually it's going to filter out therapists.
Even if you're not diagnosed with that, just selecting those boxes.
I recommend that. Yeah. Because a therapist who's been trained in PTSD is trained in evidence-based treatment for anxiety. But a lot of therapists say that they're trained in anxiety because it's just a catch-all bucket, but they probably don't have evidence-based treatment training. So I always say check the box for trauma and PTSD, because that means somebody has really done specialized training in anxiety and stress spectrum disorders. And then check the exposure therapy box. And then ask good questions, How much training do you have in exposure therapy? Do you offer interoceptive exposures for panic attacks? And if they know what that is and they can give you an example, you got it.
In those early stages, are you totally against medicine in those when people are first experiencing panic attacks? Obviously, if you go to emergency room, they're going to calm you down with a sedative.
Xanax,
Xanax, Ativan, something like that.
Yeah, the first thing I recommend my patients do is get a blood draw to see if their hormones, chemicals, thyroid is out of whack, right? Because if something like that is out of whack, there's nothing that we can do that's going to fix that. So number one, medical health and blood draw. Number two, if they are in acute distress, and I'll often see somebody after an acute trauma where they are just truly not sleeping and then they aren't able to work, and now their identity of being a person who performs in the world is being crushed, I do recommend medication. Medication can be a really good reset to just get a little bit of sleep and start to regulate the nervous system. Because if the nervous system is so dysregulated and all your biorhythms, like your circadian rhythm, your leptin and ghrelin, the hunger and satiation that you experience,
makes it really hard to get well.
Yes, if all that's out of whack and then you're like, I'm not okay, it's very hard, exactly, to take those steps. So I am a supporter of medication to stabilize somebody. But to be on it for the long term, no, because that's where cognitive behavioral and existential therapy can really help.
That's where I'm at with it. Use the medication to get stable. It has its place. And then once you're stable, then do the hard work to face it, work yourself off the medication and through the trauma to gain back control of it. That's kind of where I'm at.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm gonna ask you a question, but at first I'll start with asking you not to don't feel the need to pander to me.
Okay.
Because I am a person of faith, and I believe faith is a strong component in this. The clinical world in the biblical counseling world sometimes on a line. Where do you see spirituality, people's faith coming into helping deal with overcoming trauma, depression, anxiety, panic, all those things?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And, sometimes those worlds seem in conflict, but I actually view them as hand in hand. And I go back to Viktor Frankl's work, his book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Such a powerful book.
One of my favorites. I give presentations on that book because I think it's so powerful in terms of resilience. He's considered the grandfather of resilience and existentialism. And basically, to boil down just a couple of sound bites of what he said, is that life, we're not supposed to wait for life to show us the meaning. It's our job to create the meaning of life in every moment. And he said that what predicted resilience is when somebody that has a purpose that's both bigger than them, outside of them, and future oriented. And so just to, for the listeners who have not read this book or might not be familiar with his work, Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in World War II, and he was Jewish. So he was in the concentration camps as a detainee. And when he first went into the concentration camps, his family got pulled from him and even his clothes got taken away, but he had his life's work, his manuscript. And he said, okay, take all that. That's fine. I'm sure he didn't say that about his family, but he said, okay, whatever you do, just please don't take my manuscript. And guess what they did? Took his manuscript. He never saw it again. So his identity was totally stripped. But then he sat back and he said, this is a very horrific experience, the worst of humanity in a prolonged period. And he started to observe what predicted somebody being resilient through all of those atrocities. And he saw that even the strongest, the most physically fit men sometimes would either commit suicide in that environment or just waste away, even if they were getting enough food. And he saw that the people who, even if they weren't the most physically fit, if they had a purpose, they fought for that purpose and they were the ones that prevailed. And he gave this example of one guy who lost his entire family, and literally everything that he had. And so some people in that situation said, well, there's no point in living, and might have even been a suicide risk in that situation, right? But this guy said, okay, I've lost everything, but by golly, I will live to tell this tale because humanity needs to hear this. And I'm a witness and I need to live to tell that. And so his purpose was both bigger than him, outside of him, and future oriented. And that's what got him through. So when we look at something like spirituality, to be able to tap in, if we have no answers about anything, but somebody can say, I believe that there's a purpose in everything, and I'm not supposed to have the answers. Somebody else does. My job is to put one foot in front of the other with a little bit of that faith, then that will carry them through. So I think it is extremely important. I think that we have enough evidence in our world that there are too many things that we cannot explain, and that there are higher forces going on, whatever we want to call that, whatever words we want to put to it or concepts that is. But there has to be some level of saying, hey, life is tough, but we're all in it together. And there's something that I can trust in that keeps carrying me through. Yeah. So I do work with my clients to develop that. And if I see that they're lacking an existential or spiritual purpose, I help them figure out what that might be for them.
Yeah, I'm super proud that Smith & Wesson Firearms is a supporter of this show. I have been shooting Smith & Wesson Firearms since I was a kid. This is one of America's most patriotic companies that has been around 170 years. The Resilience Show is honored to partner with Smith & Wesson. I personally use Smith & Wesson Firearms every day for my everyday carry. I keep Smith & Wesson Firearms in my home for my home defense. When I'm out on the range practicing, it is a Smith & Wesson at the end of my grip. So check them out, and I hope you join me in carrying one of America's most iconic firearms. Yeah, it's been a big factor for me in my own recovery, the restoration of my faith, becoming a Christian, and igniting purpose inside of me, and then give me all those things you said, give me a bigger purpose outside of myself. My life isn't really about me. It's not about me. It's about others and the work that I could do in service and to my community and the world around me, and that drives me forward. And it's been a big part of my path to healing. And I think without that, I would have stayed right where I was.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So one thing that a lot of people struggle with after trauma is saying, why? And they say, God, why me? Or if God was real, he wouldn't have let this happen. And it really disrupts people's constructs of their relationship with God and what God wants. And I think that's part of what ends up being such a trauma. I'm curious for you, how you navigated that or how you make sense of that.
Yeah. So for a very long time, that was one of my sticking points of skepticism to faith, because I had been exposed to so many things, especially the death of innocent and children. And I had a specific incident where I witnessed the death of a very innocent child in Afghanistan. And so I had this question: if God was good and God created us, why would he let, this is an age-old question people always ask, why would God let bad things happen to good people? And so first of all, none of us are good from the moment we're born, right? The only good person and that ever walked this earth was Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And look what happened to him. He was born in a manger, lived his life on a run. He was, betrayed by his friends and spit on and murdered by his creation. So if that happened to him, then, it's not him. It's not God. It's this world that we live in, this broken world. And so, but the question still remained, why would God still not intervene? Like, if God hung the stars and the moon and the galaxies and all of creation, why would he not intervene? Certainly he could. If he created everything, and certainly he could. I believe in Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:1 says, the first 10 words of the Bible, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So if he created everything, then that means he's has authority over everything. And if he has authority over everything, that means he's sovereign. If he's sovereign, that means he could stop any evil from happening. So I think the question is, why doesn't he? And so that's kind of hung on that for a long time. And I was being interviewed about my story, and the interviewer, Dave Reber, he's a Vietnam veteran. He asked me the same question. He said, "You think God allowed all these bad things to happen to you?" And I answered him. I thought about it. I answered him honestly. I said, "No, I don't. I don't think he allowed them." He said, "Well, could he have stopped them?" "Oh, you think God did those things to you?" I said, "No, absolutely. I don't think God did those things to me." He said, "Well, you think he could have stopped them?" And I said, I thought about it. I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, why didn't he?" And I didn't have an answer. And he told me, he said, "Well, he trusted you with them. He trusted you could use the hardships of your life to pay lessons on others." And I thought about that because at the time, I had already spoken to over 100,000 active duty troops, and now it's over 500,000 active duty troops on this topic of spiritual resiliency and building their faith. And the only message I have to them is my life without faith and the hardships I've been through in my life. Without the hardships of my life, without me having endured those things, without faith and then finding my faith, I wouldn't have a message for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really changed my perspective on, again, I don't think God's evil by any means. I don't think he does these things to us, but could he have stopped them? Certainly he could. Why does he allow them? Because, we all grow and learn lessons off of them and able to move forward and support each other because of the hardships of our lives. And I think some of the biggest lessons in our lives come through our hardships.
Yeah, and then we get to choose what we do with that and how we lift up humanity in the ways that we can control. I really like that response. And it reminds me both of what Viktor Frankl said in that book, is that life is suffering. You shouldn't expect it to not be suffering. There's always going to be a suffering component. And there's a little bit of a ticking time bomb for everybody that, there's traumas that happen. There's loss that happens. It's just kind of a matter of time, but it is also part of life. There's also, somebody in my life who really asked that question. And then the answer that he said, he heard a voice and it came to him when he said, "God, why do you let these things happen?" It was God saying, "I don't. You all do." Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And it's that, we are creating some of this chaos and we learn from the chaos. And then we get to say, what are we going to do with it? How do we learn to be better? How do we learn to lift people up? Yeah.
It is a product of free will. I mean, God created us to have a relationship with him out of choice. And so if you have choice, then if you individually have choice, right, you're going to choose to do life God's way or your own way. And if you do it your own way, there's going to be consequences and people are going to be hurt. Every time we do things selfishly, people are hurt. And to different degrees, right? You're hurt by hurting someone's feelings, or you're hurt by murder, rape, like all, there's a degree of different ways to hurt people, but now you're injected in a world full of free will. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not God that does it, but us. Mm-hmm. So your friend's exactly right. I do think it turns to a question that I have for you is most people that I feel like get into this work have their own past and of hardships and struggle. And that's why this work's so appealing to them. Is that the case for you?
So what's interesting is, I didn't have much in my childhood that happened. There was a hardship and struggle. But I did have things that happened significantly after I got into being a psychologist, major traumas that happened, and things that, one, taught me, what PTSD is, but also really disrupted me and made me grateful for some of the tools that I had to navigate it by function of being a psychologist. It also made me look back and see some components of my childhood that I did not view as a problem, and I did not suffer what I saw as a consequence. But then over time, I kind of realized, oh, okay, that's how that shaped me. And that probably wasn't the best, right?
Well, living in this world is trauma. right?
Living in this world is trauma.
Yeah.
And, there's every single person has, something about them, whether it can be gender or there's race issues that happen. So, everybody has something that might make them more vulnerable to trauma. And, I don't really like leaving, a carrot on a stick or whatever. And I'm happy to share a little bit. But when I was in college and I did my TEDx talk from 2016, I actually told this story. But when I was in college, I woke up in the middle of the night and somebody had broken into my apartment and was standing over me while I slept. And I had just happened to wake up because I had stayed up a little bit later and I was not fully asleep. So the fact that I kind of heard a noise and woke up, it startled him. And so after that, he did harm other people in different ways. And I think that thankfully I woke up and startled him. I slept with a hammer to my pillow for a while, but it didn't bother me too much. I felt more empowered. I went to the city, I went to the apartment complex, but it was years later when I was treating sexual assault survivors that I had one nightmare. And it was happening again. And it triggered such a fear response that I was putting chairs under the door. I couldn't sleep. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I have late onset PTSD. That's exactly what I'm experiencing.
You realized what could have happened to you.
Yeah, I realized what could have happened. Yeah, I think that's what it was. Hearing all those stories, right, brought up this nightmare and saying, what if? And so then it brought this flood of symptoms. And I did exposure therapy on myself. So I actually did graduated exposure. I slept with the door unlocked one night, did not sleep a wink, but I taught my brain there's not just somebody waiting outside the door every night to get in, right? So then it retrained my brain to let go of all those kind of control behaviors that I was doing.
Did you ever consider going outside of yourself to peers and other professionals to help?
Yeah, I did some sessions of therapy during the time, but it wasn't helpful.
Yeah.
So what do you say about that? Took me a very long time to find a therapist that I felt like actually was helpful.
Find the right person, right? I can imagine, man, for example, I spent my life doing 45 years on a mat doing jiu-jitsu. If I'm going to take a jiu-jitsu lesson from you, you better be pretty impressive. So being a professional, right? Who are you going to go to? There's so many picky. Strange experiences, that I had trying to find a therapist. And, even when, there was another horrible situation where I was actually treating somebody for PTSD for one of our clinical research trials. And while I was present in the home, a child actually killed himself. It was horrible. So I was present for a suicide. And that was something that was absolutely horrific. And I witnessed all components of it. And I had to navigate my own symptoms after that for a while. And I had some support, got some therapy around it. The therapist focused a lot on self-compassion, which was helpful. But I think, looking back, I really could have used some cognitive restructuring techniques in that time. But it's even as a therapist, my biggest traumas have happened after I've become a therapist. So, thankfully the tools that I have helped me navigate that. And then knowing about resilience, because on the other side of trauma is resilience, right? It's on the same spectrum. And along with resilience is post-traumatic growth, which is a concept you've actually already alluded to, which is we go through these hard times, but then we get to choose once we've settled enough and we've healed from that, we've repaired our constructs of reality so that we feel grounded, we can then use that pain as our power and purpose. And so, being able to navigate things focused on that resilient piece and the post-traumatic growth things is something that has really helped me. Yeah, my perspective now in leading Mighty Oaks Foundation, as a public speaker, writing books, doing this podcast, my perspective now is that the very things that could have destroyed me were probably meant to destroy me physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Those things that were meant to destroy me or actually the foundation of what has made me stronger through that post-traumatic growth. And not only made me stronger, but give me a purpose and give me a mission. The very things that almost destroyed me is the foundation of my purpose now. And that's it sounds simple to speak it out, but to actually get there and have that personal perspective of that, to look at the things that I hated happened to me, that were devastating to me, that let me not sleep at night, that drove me to those panic attacks, that almost cost me my marriage, that almost cost me my relationship with my children, that led me to be, suicidal and attempt to take my own life. All those things, now I'm actually grateful for them, because those experiences are the foundation in which everything I do today is based off of.
Yeah. And look what you're doing now, the Resilience Show podcast, right? Talking about trauma and resilience to provide a roadmap for people. And when we look at, the predictors of resilience, one of the biggest ones is having a vision and a purpose, a roadmap to know how to put step by step, one foot in front of the other. And, I can say too, everything that I've been through, all my traumas have made me a better psychologist. Yes. Because now when I have the range of people who come to me, it's on a nervous system, deep level, I get it. And there's training, evidence-based training and solid treatments that we know that works. And then there's the kind of heart and soul component of it, is that we are all humans going through this grinder of life. And so to be honest about the reality of being human, which is hard, I think can be, very healing too. So that's why I'm open about it, is, hey, I'm a psychologist and I'm also a fellow human, but we're all here to work together, to grow together and lift each other up.
I picked that up about you right when I started talking to you, that you were a very pragmatic, person in front of your titles and academics. With that, you use the word a lot today of evidence-based. I guess explain what evidence-based means and where does it fall in a criteria for treatment?
Yeah. So evidence-based means there's enough research over time to show that it's effective. And when we have these different waves of treatment, we call it, third wave CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, then we've adjusted it enough times to make it work even better. So there's a lot of new age approaches that aren't evidence-based, but people jump on the bandwagon, but it might not be helpful. And then we find that out over time. And so what is evidence-based is cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's second and third waves of that. So acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based approaches, exposure and response prevention, all of that falls under that bucket. Even existential approaches that work in helping somebody shift their constructs of reality and the purpose of their life, very helpful, because that kind of falls in the cognitive category.
Yeah.
But what we want to be careful with is kind of, something that somebody says definitely really works, because if there's not enough evidence and research around it, then it might actually be doing some harm.
And the problem, I'm not disagreeing with you, but the problem I've seen with this approach is that there's not to my knowledge, a governing body that gives evidence-based stamp. And so different people will claim evidence-based, and then other people disqualify something that actually is evidence-based. So it seems kind of very loose. I just recently testified before Congress on alternative treatments to mental health because the Congress had the VA had came to this determination that they would not give any mental health treatment unless it was approved by the FDA, which to me is a conflict of interest, because now you have one government agency that has a interest in the pharmaceutical industry giving authority over another government agency. They should be separated, and they're controlling, which seemed like a conflict of interest, the mental health approach to VA, which means all clinical. All medicinal. And I believe that, and I believe you believe too, there should be treatment outside of medicinal, including other things that are evidence-based and some things that may not be. I mean, for me, this is my personal perspective. For me, PTSD, for a lot of individuals, particularly combat veterans, I believe those are very much a spiritual wound when you're dealing with human life. And I believe it's there's a wound to the soul, and a spiritual wound requires a spiritual solution. And so omitting faith programs from being an option for those solutions, which is what the VA has done, is taking something off the table that could help a lot of people. And the pushback was, well, we only do evidence-based program. And I'm there's a lot of really great evidence-based or research and evidence of faith programs having been successful. We did a third-party independent doctoral study by the Biblical Counseling Coalition and some universities that did a 3-year study over 1,000 participants and went through a program, and it outperformed the clinical studies that were evidence-based. And so I think on that side, people would the authorities to be in the government would say, well, it's not evidence-based, so it's not good.
Right.
And then there's other people that say they are evidence-based and they're not. So is there some kind of like authoritative body that.
Yeah. Well, so I don't think, so the spiritual based approaches, I don't think that they've been standardized.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is there's not like a process of exactly what people get presented with at what time point.
Right.
And I think that's the issue of doing research, because everybody is doing spiritual therapy a little bit differently.
Like we have everybody else, we have our methodology.
Exactly. And so then you get one group doing spiritual therapy this way, another group doing it totally different, and nobody's agreeing on what components are the things that work. And so for something to get to be that evidence-based level, which, I think there's things that work that aren't that, right? But to get to that level, you have to standardize it by saying, okay, spiritual therapy is defined as this. First, there's a conversation about what is God to this person. Second session is about this. And then all parties who are doing spiritual-based therapy agree to that process of it. We have not had that. I wish somebody would create that, honestly.
Yeah, same. Who would put the stamp on it?
So usually it's the American Psychological Association, the APA. That's our governing body, and they filter through all the research. So I think that they are the ones, I probably should know that answer, but I don't know.
Yeah. I
think that they're the ones who do that, and the VA seeks everything from the APA. And the problem is I've had many trauma survivors come to me in private practice who've been harmed by spiritual based approaches.
Sure.
And then I have to undo some of that work. But it's the stuff probably that you guys don't do, but it's reinforcing some really negative beliefs about themselves that they had. Horrible. And so it deepens the trauma, and then I have to undo that, right? Yeah. So I think that's why, from the spiritual perspective, yes, it's helpful. And I do that I call it elevated CBT or existential CBT, because I pull in the existential side, the spiritual side, the faith-based side, because I 100% believe that is very helpful. And our research does show that having a spiritual belief system does create a lot of resilience. So we do know that. Yeah. We just have yet to have standardized the process. Yeah. And I think that would be really cool if you did something like that, like a 5-session protocol and intervention for spiritual-based therapy that becomes the gold standard.
Yeah, super interesting, because I do agree with you, by the way, like probably some of those harmful people out there are some people of the faith or claim that have that's why you probably have dealt with people with church hurt, right? Like this is, when men are a position of authority and theology gives people authority, it's often abused and manipulated, and people get hurt.
Yes.
And so there is I can see that being a factor.
And it's true across everything too,
sure,
right? There's bad players in every domain of everything. And so, I think that there's a lot to be fleshed out. And that's why this area is difficult, because in the medical world, you can draw blood, you can test it. Everybody agrees on how to test it, and then you get an outcome, right? In mental health and therapy land and emotions and disorders, everybody's experiencing it a little bit different. Every therapist does therapy a little bit differently. And the hardcore research approach still isn't helpful for everyone. And that's why one of the several reasons why I left the hardcore research world, is because it was too rigid and structured. And that's not effective or aligned with how life is.
Well, outside of being a doctor of trauma and all these things you do, you're also a freediving instructor.
Yes.
Which is pretty awesome.
Thank you.
I love the water, obviously. I'm here, and the first thing I did when I got off the airplane is jumped in the ocean with some sharks, because I love the water. But I've always been infatuated with freediving, because I've always been infatuated with breath holds. Like, I think everyone on our team I talked about today, being in special operations, our job has done at least a 50-meter underwater crossover. I'll brag a little bit and say I've done a 75. That's my longest ever done, which is 75 meters. And I used to really be big on working on my breath hold. It was like something, but I never actually did free diving. Every time I go scuba diving, like the boat stops, everybody's getting on the boat, I always jump back out. I tell the dive master I have to go pee. So I jump in the water, but really doing it as I'm wanting to go dive down. Because usually a boat's anchoring like 60 feet of water. I just go down and touch it. Like, I just love going on the water.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So, but I never did anything formal like free diving. And so you're an instructor.
Yeah.
And tomorrow you're going to take me.
I am.
And
I
give me some
can't
lessons
wait.
and take me freediving. So
Yes.
what am I going to experience?
All right. So there's a couple of different skills that we're going to practice. So you just talked about dynamic apnea. That is one type of freediving. So you guys are going to have a dynamic apnea test.
Okay.
It's not going to be 50 meters. So you don't have to do it for that far. If you want to, you can. So we've got dynamic apnea that you're going to show you can swim underneath water, one breath, hold that long. We have static apnea. This is where you hold your breath without moving and without diving, just on the surface of the water to get your peak apnea breath hold time. And so we're going to do some classroom component. I'm going to explain the science to you, but everybody has this ability ready to be tapped within them. It's called the mammalian dive reflex. And so, this whole journey into freediving for me, I never would have predicted it, 5-6 years ago. If you would have asked me, I would have said, what? No, there's no way. And then here I am, right? I have my ocean-oriented company, take people out at sea and do resilience training through the vehicle of freediving. So to me, it is powerful, and it has that existential, beautiful earth connection, spiritual connection, if people want it to, component to it.
So this isn't just a hobby. This connects to your clinical world.
Yeah. To the clinical world too. I feel what is my mission is connecting people more deeply to themselves and to our planet Earth through the ocean. But tomorrow we're going to get to experience that. So we're going to do the dynamic apnea, the static apnea, and then we get to do the freediving line dive. So this is where we anchor a line. So we have a float with a line and then a weight at the bottom. So the line is taut. And then we're going to dive, a technical dive down that line where we get to experience in real time the effects of physics on our biology. And it's 90% mental. So to even go there, meter by meter, we have to learn trust. We have to step into trust about it. So it's going to be a really great experience.
Yes, we're going to go down the line and come back up. Do we, or do you have equipment for us? Like, what do we do? Do we use fins?
Yeah,
we use
so all you
nose
need is a
clamp,
mask.
So you have to have a saliva.
Just your scuba mask. I have some extra masks, a weight belt, which you might need to find, and then long fins ideally, but you could use scuba fins if you want to.
Okay.
So we'll figure it out.
Okay.
We'll get it together.
We'll improvise on it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what life is about anyway, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Bootstrapping it a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. We, with the group of guys you have here, they're definitely going to be pushing limits. You could probably have to keep us from being competitive.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, somebody's going to pass out.
Well, there's rules. Safety's number one, buddy system. And it's funny. I'm so glad that we're taking that time tomorrow because we came here to film the TV show, which has been phenomenal. And I mean, I'm just so impressed with every level of that. And I'm just so grateful to even be a part of that. Yeah. And so I didn't even know that we were going to do freediving training. So I'm so glad. We have our local contact here, Chandre, local Bahamian, who anything that we need, he will be able to find. And we're gonna do it. And it's amazing mindset training. It's, we talked today about the bicep curls or the bench press for the frontal lobe.
Yes.
That's essentially what freediving is.
Explain that. The bench, you said that earlier on the episode.
Yeah.
The bench press for the frontal lobe.
Technically, it's reappraisal skills. So reappraisal means I have one interpretation of something that happens, but then I can think about that interpretation. So that's Meta-Cognition. So I'm observing my thought, and then I get to choose another interpretation that's probably more true, more accurate, and more helpful. So for example, like we were talking about panic earlier, if we start to feel a little bit shaky or unsteady and we appraise that as I'm not okay and something bad is going to happen, then that flood of panic starts to happen more easily. Instead, if we appraise those symptoms, and this is usually after therapy that somebody's had with interoceptive exposures, if those symptoms come up and we reappraise that as, oh, my body's just making an adjustment. Doesn't matter. I can just flow through it. Then we're not going to have that cascade of panic response. So that's what we call reappraisal. When we're in full limbic system arousal, which is the amygdala and fear response, we cannot think critically. It's very hard to do a reappraisal skill. So freediving is about in real time. And I always say, I don't care who you are on planet Earth. The moment I take you underwater without air, your alarm bells go off. So it's a perfect little like petri dish to feel those alarm bells in real time and then step into those reappraisal skills. I know I'm okay. I know the science. I know that I have tons of air and that I know that I can do this as long as I'm willing to feel uncomfortable. And then that's how the brain learns and that's how those neurons get stronger.
You were saying earlier, because, I've felt the symptoms so many times before, and I've had shallow water blackouts before, pushing myself. But when you think you're out of air, when you start hearing the ringing in your ears, when the black tunnel starts closing in, you actually have much more air than you think you do.
So much more. Yeah, it's just a sensation. And of course, we don't want to push our limits too far because the blackouts, right?
Yeah.
Blackouts are not bad for you. They are not dangerous physiologically. We're made for them. So even with a blackout, you still have time, that your body's protecting you as an enclosed system before something bad happens. But within that time, you sure enough better be pulled up by a buddy and, brought to and whatever. But the goal is to not black out. So we have a lot of space before we black out. People tend to feel those first feelings and then appraise that as, I don't have oxygen, and then they abort mission, right? So freediving is about feeling those feelings, but saying like, no, I know the science. That's only CO2 buildup. That has nothing to do with my oxygen levels. So therefore, I get to choose to keep going forward. I will not be tricked by my alarm bells. I'll tell you a story. I take these different groups out. So I do expeditions through Ocean Oriented, whether it's, teams at a company, or last year I was hired by Simplify, which is an amazing veterans organization.
Simplify Fun?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're great.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And so we did a whole group of 12 veterans. We did it down in the Keys. So a full ocean-oriented expedition for about 5 days. And so some of these guys, they were missing limbs. So one guy was a double amputee. And, when the lady of Simplify called me and she said, can you do this? I said, yes. And I thought, what have I agreed to, right? Because I couldn't have found anybody online that had done that before. And I was worried, but then I thought, okay, I'm not going to trust those alarm bells. I'm going to say, if we think through this step by step, we can make anything happen, right? And sure enough, we did. And that was one of the most profound ocean-oriented expeditions. If I thought too hard about it, I could come to tears right now because it was just so amazing. And I'm so glad that I didn't let my own alarm bells trick me into saying no, right? Or trick me into perceiving limitations that did not exist. And at our roundtable discussion, we kind of have this little ceremony at the end of the expedition. And one of my questions is, what are you going to take from this? What are you going to leave behind? And we go around and everybody answers. There's this one veteran who was a quieter one of the bunch. And when it got to him, he said something that made all of our jaws just drop. He said, I'm leaving behind here in this ocean, I'm going to leave behind my perceived sense of lack. Because just like I thought I lacked oxygen, I also think that I lack love, money, and time. And now I know that most of that feeling is just a perception. And it does not mean that it's true. I get to choose what's true. So I'm leaving behind that feeling of lack and going forth into my life knowing that I have an abundance of money, time, and love if I just shift some things and seek to find it a little bit more. Yeah. Or find it within myself, right? He had this whole
dive
thing.
a little bit deeper.
Dive a little bit deeper, exactly. And we were just like, oh my gosh. And that's why, ocean-oriented isn't just about going on the ocean and having fun. It's not just about learning freediving. Freediving is a vehicle to deeper aspects of yourself and pulling that into all other areas of your world. What we learn there ends up being pretty profound. Even the bad things that happen. One time a lady got sucked in a current and taken out to sea, and I thought, oh my God,
we lost
what are we going to do? Right? And then last minute, somebody grabbed her. And it ended up being one of the most bonding, hilarious things of the trip.
Yeah.
Most times the bad things don't happen. Even if they do, we can navigate them. And I think that's an important take home, is that we are made to pull in resilient pieces to help us get through.
So ocean oriented, that's one of your resilience expeditions. From those struggling with PTSD, panic, obviously it's a scary thing, right? Somebody's going to go underwater and hold their breath and push their limits. You're pushing your limits. Mm-hmm. So these are people that are already dealing with, some of these folks are already dealing with anxiety, panic. What's the process to get them to that point for you?
Yeah. So, when people come on the expedition, they have to be stabilized enough to where that PTSD isn't going to be a star player, right?
It's not going to antagonize it.
Exactly.
That's the right word.
Because in that role, so in the role of ocean oriented, I'm not functioning as a clinical psychologist under my license, which means I'm not diagnosing and I'm not applying evidence-based treatment. That's in my private practice. And I have to be very clear about that, right? But in that role, it's adventure-based. And I used to work for Wounded Warriors, where we went out and did, these adventures. But basically what we're doing is we're using this environment to challenge ourselves, but just like we talked about with exposure therapy, not too much, right? We're not going to push it too much and flood it. So exactly, or make it worse. So everybody, we find the edge, and one person's edge might be here and the other person's edge might be all the way out there, right? But we find the edge and we just work with that edge so that that person ends up feeling empowered, ends up being at a greater place than when they began. And we have a team. So my team is trained on how to deal with those sensitivities. And that actually happened on a couple of expeditions where somebody said, I'm overwhelmed, I'm out. And then they sought their safe space. We had a team member with them. And there was actually a lot that came from that too, because everybody has their own individual growth plan and a measure of resilience that we take pre and post trip so that we can see how their resilience scores shift. And then also what they're working on in their individual growth plan.
I like hearing that because you obviously you work in one world that's evidence-based and then this other one that's freediving is not evidence-based, but clearly it's helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, mountain biking, jiu-jitsu, like there's all kind of things that's helpful.
I would say it is evidence-based because we know that nature is very powerful and profound.
Sure.
So it's kind of like, what do you want to pull from that is evidence? Maybe it's not protocol-based. Here's a definition. I think we just kind of define something. Protocol-based versus evidence-based.
Yeah, because I would again, like you're nailing it. Because I would argue that the methodology and spiritual, biblical living that we use in Mighty Oaks, to me, is completely evidence-based. Like you can convince me it's not evidence-based, but maybe it's broadly protocol-based. And so
right, and if there could be a broader protocol, then it would be a little bit more recognized, I think. But it still doesn't quite matter because we know that spiritual approaches are evidence-based in general. So we know that having a spiritual component to your belief system is very helpful in terms of mental health symptoms and resilience. So we do know that in the research. We also do know that spending time in nature is very helpful for those things. We also know that adventure-based sports, especially when done in nature, is very helpful for mental health and resilience and all that health. And so we do know, based in literature, there's just not a protocol around exactly how to do each one.
I think that's the new word, right?
Yeah,
I like that we discovered that. I want to get into the last part of this. Really want to get into the word resilience and resiliency and how that applies to you, how that applies to the show, all the listeners. But before I do, I don't want to miss this. We're talking about freediving in a very entry level of what we're going to do tomorrow for the first time, what you're doing with the expeditions, the resilience expeditions. But how far have you taken freediving personally? Like I mean, there's people that have done. I mean, what's the deepest someone has went? I think
over 400 feet at this point. I think for men and women. So I think the women's is like 420 something feet, and I think men are pushing like 460, 470 now.
Which is insane.
Yeah, I know it's not extremely accurate, but it's in those numbers. Yeah.
So how far have you taken it?
So for level 3 in PADI, which is a third atmosphere of pressure, is a little over 100 feet. So that's where I've been. Now, to get there consistently, you need consistent training. I'm not a consistent depth training freediver. I'm a psychologist, in my day job. So my comfy zone is really like 40 to 65 or 70 feet. So that's, a little bit past neutral buoyancy into the third atmosphere, but not going super deep. So I like spearfishing in that zone. I like hanging out in that zone. But I don't really have a need to go deeper. I don't have a need to push that myself. My goal with freediving is to bring it to other people, to expand their worlds, both internally and externally through the vehicle of freediving. I believe the magic happens in level 1 and level 2 freediving, where you learn and can, maximize your biological performance under the physics of the earth, the water.
Is level 1 atmosphere?
Yep, exactly.
Which is 33 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And what physiological symptoms are you experiencing at 1 atmosphere?
That's when things change the most. So water expands and compresses, expands and compresses the most within that first level.
It's 100%. That's the biggest change in the atmosphere.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what's interesting is 1 atmosphere of pressure from this ground that we're standing on, it's literally to the atmosphere, which scientists can't even, I think, agree on exactly where that is. It's a gradient, right? So, that's like miles, right? You get that same 1 atmosphere of pressure and 33 feet underwater. So you can imagine there's a lot that's happening in real time. And you know that as a scuba diver, right? With freediving, it can be a little bit more intense because you don't have the pressurized air. So you're having to deal with a lot more.
Which makes novice diving dangerous because people think, oh, well, I'm only 33 feet, so I can make an emergency descent. while I'm breathing compressed air, and you think it's not that big of a deal. The emergency procedure, because the surface is so close, where that's the biggest change in pressure. So you can have one of the biggest atmospheric changes in your body and get bent or, have decompression sickness.
Exactly. And this is why statistically scuba diving is a lot more dangerous than free diving is, because free diving, you have one breath of air, one lung fill, and you're not changing that at all, right? So you go down with what you had in your lungs and come up with. So you don't have to worry about the barotrauma coming up.
Yeah, there's no decompression sickness risk at all.
Exactly. So we're an enclosed system. We're doing everything so naturally, and that's part of why I love it. But in that first atmosphere of pressure, you're learning firsthand about all the physics, what it's doing to your body. You're learning how to equalize without that compressed air. And it's a completely new skill. So I think, in that first level, people are really understanding that they do have this capability. Every single person does. Even if somebody was scared of the ocean, even if somebody had like a swimming/drowning trauma, even if somebody didn't ever even want to be in the water, but they start to hear the science and then they get on board, there's just magic that happens in that first one, because it just opens up worlds for people.
And level 2 is?
Yep, down to 60 feet. And that's where you reach neutral buoyancy. So then this is where the gravity shifts. So in level 1, you have to fight to get away from the surface because your air pockets are so big, and they start shrinking as you get down into level 2. Around 45 feet in level 2, it ends at 60 feet is where you reach neutral buoyancy. And when you pass that, you start to sink, because your air pockets are so small.
You just even think of that scary.
Yeah, it's wild.
Now you're getting sucked down, especially if you're in like hundreds of feet or thousands of feet of water, like below you, you're starting to sink in that. Now when you turn around, you have to fight to come back up.
Kick even harder, yeah. There's this amazing video of Alenka Artnik, who held the women's world record for a very long time. And I cry every time I watch it. It has the perfect song to it. And you see every component of the freediving down into, I think she reached 400 feet with that. And so you see her going into the second atmosphere. You see the changes in her kick. In the third atmosphere, she stops kicking. She's just, going head down. Her arms are kind of waving in the water like a flag on a flagpole. And you see the little particles zipping past her. She's not doing anything. She's sinking like a rock to the core of the earth.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And then at some point, she has to decide where her turnaround point is. That she has the ability to get back.
Exactly. And that's why training is important. That's why conditioning, and because she knows her limits, right? And there is the plate. When they do it competitively, they put a plate on the bottom. And so there's little rivets on the rope, and you can tell that you're getting close to the plate, and then you hit it and you turn around. But I'm not going that deep. Let's just put it that way.
You ever see this video? It's this blue hole. The guy walks to the edge of it, stands on it.
That's Dean's Blue Hole. That's here in the Bahamas.
Where's that?
In Long Island.
Yeah. So
Dean's Blue Hole.
It's you say King's?
Dean's
Blue Hole.
Yeah.
It's an amazing video. He stands on the edge of it. He's and then he just goes down and he climbs out of it. But it's like 300 feet deep at the bottom.
Yeah,
to the bottom.
666.
666.
Which is kind of a weird number.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We should throw a rock down there and make it 665.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to touch. Or dig a hole and go a little deeper. 667.
I hope it's.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm not superstitious, but I'm extremely superstitious.
Yeah, exactly. Now we feel a little funny about that one. But yeah, no, it's really deep. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
Because that's why they do the world competitions in Dean's Blue Hole. And it's just epic. So I wish we could go there. And that's where I did all my training, was in Dean's Blue Hole.
Really?
In fact, after this is over, I'll show you a picture from Dean's Blue Hole. And it's just it's on that ledge. It's just incredible.
So let's go to and kind of close up with resilience and resiliency. This is the name of the show, is the Resiliency Show. Talking about, mind, body, spirit, social, all 4 pillars. You have to be mentally tough, physically tough, endure life. You have to be socially connected to the right people, surround yourself with the right people. I believe also that 4th pillar, the spiritual one, you have the strong spiritual foundation and believe in something bigger than yourself. Free diving could comprise of all of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? You have to be physically strong and healthy. You have to be healthy to do it. You have to be fit. You have to mentally have the mindset, the perspective, the mentality to do it. Socially, you're not going to gain. You have to be trained with team and trust other people for your training. And man, for me, I couldn't imagine doing something like that without a strong spiritual foundation. So I think that all those things rely on that. And then the work you do in psychology has a lot to do with all four pillars of resiliency. You spoke about them all. So when you think about resiliency, what's resiliency mean to you? What's being resilient, a resilient human being look like to you?
Yeah. So the way that we define resilience in the field is when a trauma happens or a big stressor, resilience is the ability to bounce back pretty quickly. So you return to your pre-crisis state relatively quickly after something has happened. Post-traumatic growth is even better. Post-traumatic growth is, yes, you bounce back, but you actually become better because of what happened. It was a catalyst for your own growth and change. Maybe your relationships get deeper. Maybe the way that you're contributing to the world gets more profound. Whatever it is, right? So that's post-traumatic growth. It's a step beyond resilience. Now, when we look at resilience in the research, so anytime I define something, I always look to all the people who've been hammering this out for, decades to define what exactly this is and how we measure it. And I use a measure called the PR6. It's the predictive resilience factor with 6 domains. And these map perfectly onto the 4 pillars of this resilience show. And so these 6 domains, the number one, because it's the biggest predictor of resilience, is having a strong purpose and a vision for your life. So that no matter what's happening, no matter what shitstorm is blowing around you, you know what next step to take. You've got a roadmap, right? That's why purpose and vision is so important. The second biggest important piece of resilience is social support. So you named that pillar too. So this is kind of the spiritual piece. Then we have a social piece. So just knowing that you have some type of community around you is such a mitigator of so many different factors and distress signals that get locked in. So having a strong community of support. The next one is what we worked on today and what we talked about, you and I a little bit, is composure. So we have to be able to regulate our nervous system, get our heart rate lower, and compose ourselves before we can step into the next domain of resilience, which is reasoning. So we have to have composure before we can actually start to think critically with our frontal lobe.
And those two both are mentally.
Yeah, exactly. They are. This one's a little bit body-based, but you have to think about
physical
it.
As well, body, yeah.
Exactly. You have to think about it and have a tool to use to compose yourself and then step into reasoning. The fourth one is very mental, and you already mentioned this one too, is tenacity. Having a tenacious mindset, which essentially means saying, no matter what happens to me, I know that I can get through. I might feel at the bottom of the barrel, but I'm just going to give it time and reach out to my community. And there's things that can be put in place to, help me get through this. So that's a tenacious mindset. And the last pillar is health, getting good sleep, exercise, putting good things in your body. So all 6 of those factors come together to create somebody's resilience score. And many times somebody is really high in 2 of them and then low in 1 of them. And then that is their area of work.
I love how you explain that because, one, they fit into the 4 pillars we talk about here, but they all like, none of them, as you explained it, none of them seemed independent. They all seem to tie together with each other, and the way those kind of come together and blend together is what makes someone truly resilient.
Absolutely. They're all related and interconnected. And so you can't have a tenacious mindset if you have 0 social support, right? So it's like, they all relate, and having that strong purpose and vision, knowing why we're taking one day at a time is extremely important. Even to reach out to community, we have to have a purpose and vision around that, or some kind of worth within ourselves to tap into. Yeah, we can deepen that conversation in so many ways.
What would you say to someone? I mean, for me personally, I think if someone doesn't have, they might be like crushing it on 3 of the pillars, but if one of them's missing, they're going to struggle. They're going to fall. And so if someone was self-evaluating as they're hearing us talking and saying, I'm really good in 2 of those, but the other 2, I'm not where I need to be, or one of those I'm not where I need to be, what would your advice be to them?
My advice would be to reach out to somebody who can help, whether this is if you have somebody in your life or somebody that you tend to look towards and say, man, they have that thing that I really struggle with. Reach out to them and ask them to be a mentor. I've done that. That's literally why I started my own company back in the day. I just found this psychologist on Twitter and thought it was cool what she was doing and asked her to be my mentor. She gave me the purpose and vision that helped me form my own company.
Yeah, coach you through it.
Exactly. She said yes. I was a total cold.
Most people are honored.
Most people are honored, and most people will say yes because nobody asks. Yeah. And I always, when I give talks, I always say, reach out to me and ask. Hardly anybody does. But every once in a while I have somebody who does, and I say, absolutely, we will have some sessions and I will help you get there. So look around you. Who is inspiring, cold reach out to them and just ask. They might not respond. They might say yo and no, but they also might say yes, right? And that's where that road opens up. I mean, obviously therapy can be really helpful, but you have to find the right therapist. You have to have the right personality match. You know, you should end a therapy session feeling like, wow, like I can't believe we went there and that felt really helpful, or it was hard, but this is what I need to be doing. Find somebody who can create that roadmap with you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Outstanding. Did we miss anything?
I think we may have covered it all.
Yeah, I think we covered it all. That was great. And not only was it great, but it was even extra special because it was last minute and we didn't really prepare. So it felt super organic.
Yeah. Thank you so much for, not just having me, but also creating a platform for this. I mean, everything that you've done through your training and experience, and then transforming that into the MMA, and then transforming from there to be, a voice in the resilience space. It's very needed. And I think we are on the cusp, we're all becoming more and more aware as a human population around what is trauma and how to get over it and how to lead with love. And so I think that what you're doing here is just amazing, and I'm so happy to be a part.
Well, I appreciate it. I've had a wild, long journey. I got to do a lot of things, but there's always been people to help me like along the way, and every step, every place that I've gotten to has been because somebody contributed and invested in me, and I'm kind of at a point in my life where I just want to give back, and I don't think I have enough lifetime left to pay back what other people have done for me. So I get to do that through Mighty Oaks Foundation, some other nonprofits and humanitarian work that I do, speaking, my books, and in this show. And so yeah, it's pretty amazing to be part of that. And same for you, like the work you're doing. Obviously, as a therapist, you can be very focused on just doing therapy, but obviously you have a heart to go outside and do work with others. I love the diving thing. I'm super thankful you're here and that I'm going to get in the water tomorrow and do my first free dive. I'm pretty pumped.
Yeah, thank you. I'm pumped too. It's gonna be fun.
Well, we have normally we have like all kind of gifts. We're known, this podcast is known to give the best gifts, and because this was not planned, we don't have any of those gifts, but we're definitely going to get you hooked up with some stuff. We have Smith & Wesson, Vortex Optics, Gators Eyewear, BioPro is an amazing company that you being a healthy person, you might appreciate BioPro and BioAccelerator, just amazing companies. So we want to make sure you get hooked up with some of our sponsors. So we'll do that. And we're going to have some incredible Patreon content of the behind the scenes stuff that we did today that we're going to do tomorrow. So you definitely don't want to miss the Patreon content we have. Where can people follow you?
On Instagram, Dr. Lindsay Bira, and Ocean Oriented.
Okay, the website, Ocean Oriented. We'll have all that in the show notes, guys. If you have not done so yet, like, subscribe, share, comment, all that stuff. And please go to our Patreon. Look at the show notes below. Go to our Patreon and join our Patreon family to see all the behind the scenes content. Again, we're going to have some incredible stuff with you tomorrow that we talked about. And couldn't do it without you guys. Thank you so much. And God bless. Stay resilient. And thank you.
Thank you. Just a gift being here.
Hey, what's up, Resilient family? I am so grateful for each of you who tune in every week to hear our episodes. We have such incredible guests and topics that I am passionate about, our team's passionate about, and we could not do it without you. So we're thankful for you. We love you. We appreciate you locking arms with us to be more informed, to become a more resilient community. And I want to invite you to become a tighter part of that community by joining us on Patreon. If you go to our show notes below, you can click the link and get dialed into our Patreon and get extra content weekly. You can join for $15 a month and get behind the scenes footage, get closer access to me. I have monthly Zooms that I'll be doing with some members of the community. And so we'd love to get more involved. Again, go below in the show notes and click the link and join today.